Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Keystone Chronicles podcast. With us this week, we're getting woolly bugged. Mr. Micheal Evanko comes through the studio, and we have ourselves a great conversation. In this one, guys, we get pretty deep into kind of the way that fishing can make you feel and how you can move throughout your life in a different way once you learn just some of the things that go on in your mind and your mental mindset while you're able to be out there fishing. And in this one, we go with fly fishing specifically, and it's a deep conversation. I think that there's points in here that we make and talk about that some of you guys are going to really connect with and really enjoy because you can understand where we're coming from. And, you know, I think that there's a lot to be said about why we like to fish and what that does for our psyche. You know, I always preach that is part of my getaway, and I need that release. That's something that I can do outside of the hunting season that keeps me sane, if you will. And for those of you that don't really understand or know where I'm coming from, this is where I really suggest that you get out on the stream or you get out on the lake with somebody who's willing to help you, and I'm sure that you would not have a hard time finding someone that would be able to help you. So it's one of those things that most people don't experience and just kind of look through a window at and think maybe that's not for me, or why would they want to do something like that? But just don't judge it is what I'm getting at. And you know, this show is full of more people that are interested in that stuff than anything. But on the flip side, reach out to somebody, especially youth, and get them out on the water and teach them this way of life, because I've been on this earth for 32 years and I haven't found anything that does what the outdoors do for me. So if we can pass that on and keep our traditions going, it's better for all of us, and that doesn't necessarily mean we have to show them our favorite spot. So I really hope you guys enjoy this one, guys. Mike was a great guest. He has some great content. Woolly Bugged, that's his Instagram handle. He's got a great YouTube channel. Guys, check it out, man. It's really good stuff. So, Mike, thank you for coming through, and I really hope you guys enjoy. Don't forget to rate, comment, subscribe, Spotify, and on the Apple Podcast app. That really helps the show moving forward. Thank you, guys. Here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Keystone Chronicles podcast. With us this week, Micheal Evanko. Mike, am I saying that right?
Yes, you actually did a great job of pronouncing that.
Perfect. Sometimes I knock them out of the park, and then other times I got a whole list of stuff here that I want to ask you, and I get ahead of myself and start thinking about that stuff. But Mike, I've been chasing you around for a while, man, and you got just some awesome fish that I know that you've caught throughout the years. So I'm super excited for this conversation. We were talking a little bit too much before we come on. I always do that, and I get to talking and I get all excited. But who are you? Maybe where you're from, and what kind of fisherman are you?
Well, thanks, Marcus, and I appreciate you having me on. This is actually the first podcast I've ever done.
That's awesome.
I've had other people reach out to me, and it just never worked out till now. So I'm happy to be speaking to you.
Great.
My name's Micheal. You can call me Mike, and I am originally from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I spent most of my life in Pennsylvania. I did spend a stint in Florida and Virginia when I was young, but most of my time has been spent here in Pennsylvania. And I spent time fishing the streams of Lancaster County and Dauphin County and York County growing up. And probably my first introduction to fly fishing was through people that I went to high school with, spending time down in Boiling Springs and Camp Hill area, where, as you know, there's some pretty well-known streams down in that part, whether it's the Latort or the Yellow Breeches. And those places were really where I was first introduced to the concept of fly fishing. But for most of my childhood and teens, I was a spin fisherman. My father and I, spent Saturdays on the Susquehanna River and the Juniana River in a little 12-foot V-bottom bass boat. And that's really where I cut my teeth learning about fish and learning about the rivers of Pennsylvania. Specifically, smallmouth bass were a big part of my time growing up. And when we fished for trout, it was usually stock trout, and it was with power bait or spinners and a spin rod, a little, 5 or 6 foot ugly stick
Yep.
with a small spin reel.
Yep.
And that's really how I got started with fishing, and a little bit about where I'm from.
So, would you attest that your biggest mentor in fishing was your dad?
So I would say my father introduced the love of the outdoors to me.
Uh-huh.
I'm a big believer that when you were young, I think that your experiences at that time in your life really wire you for who you become and what your interests are, and where you find excitement and passion. And for me, my father would take me along on his fishing adventures and his hunting trips. And he was an explorer. And I think for him, it was also part of showing his kid, his passion. And so that kind of was passed to me. And I think at that young age, it just kind of is ingrained in you, and you can't shake it. And it becomes your makeup. And I think you then go back to that as you get older.
Yeah.
And so I would say my father, number one, but there were certainly people through the years that had an impact on my fishing knowledge, and then eventually what brought me to fly fishing.
Right. I think that most of us start that way, like you said, maybe starting with a spinning rod, and maybe it's similar to starting small game hunting instead of jumping right into big game hunting. But as we progress and as we get more in tune with the whole techniques and the aspect of actually learning a stream or learning a lake and being able to read water, you just want more of a challenge. And it's just once you get into fly fishing, it gets much harder and much more technical in the way that you do things. You don't just pull a spool back and cast up over your head and the line goes out 50 feet in front of you. So
that is very true. And my path to fly fishing maybe doesn't go as far back as some people. It wasn't until I was in my college years at Penn State where I really started to find fly fishing and my interest was piqued. I had a friend growing up, Matt, who I still fish with to this day. And Matt always fly fished. And every time I would take my spin rod, Matt would have his fly rod. So I knew of it, but my interest wasn't really piqued until I was at Penn State. And I still remember the first time that I ever caught a fish on a fly rod. Matt and I would go out to a lot of the big streams there in Center County. And he took me down to the Little J one day, and we found a pod of rising fish. And it was the first time that he actually offered to pass that fly rod to me and cast a dry fly. And I put it upstream, and when that fish came up and hit it, and I felt that fish on a fly rod for the first time, it was just so different than any experience I'd ever had. And it's just a different connection to the fish than what you experience using regular, or what I would call regular tackle. And I was just curious from that point on. And I think that's kind of where the evolution started, to me moving from spin fishing to fly fishing and realizing that there's a much deeper experience to pursue here.
Yeah, I would agree with you. There's a lot to be said about the connection between a fly rod and the person using it, and why they become so obsessed. That's really the word I want to use, because it seems like most guys don't just decide, well, today I'm going to take the fly rod, or today I'm going to take the spin rod, or whatever else they have. They kind of stick to one thing, and I do understand how that works. So.
And for me, it was really kind of fighting and clawing almost to adopt it, because there were a couple of years in there where I really struggled with learning. we didn't always have access to everything that's on YouTube and the web like we do now.
Right.
I mean, the kids coming up today have access to so much fly fishing knowledge. And back then, even the early 2000s, before the web was super prolific and social media was super prolific, you still really did rely on books to some extent. And especially with fly fishing, that's where I initially learned things, and it was just fishing with other people that took the time to show me something, who dealt with my constant questions. How do you tie this knot? Can you show me how to tie that knot for the 50th time? And can you explain to me the leader and the tippet? And I kind of take it for granted now. The things that I know how to do, they almost come like second nature now. But there was a time where those things didn't make sense to me. I didn't understand it. And it's funny how there's that gap that you eventually bridge, and it just becomes second nature.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes more than a muscle memory, but at the same time, you were really uh, expressing what we were talking about earlier with you had somebody who was patient enough to show you over and
Mm-hmm.
over again and pass that knowledge on to you. So
Mm-hmm.
on the flip side of your journey now, how hard it was for you to understand or learn, and that's probably why they were so patient with you. And that's why, you were probably so patient with the people that you teach also, because it's not something that you would just get overnight, whereas I could probably take my 8-year-old godson and teach him how to cast a spinning rod in an hour's worth of time. So,
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's also just educating yourself and having a deeper understanding of fishing and the fish that you're chasing and the environment that you're chasing them in.
yep.
And, I think with the world of fly fishing, it just naturally dives deeper into that world and that environment. And you have to understand those things at a very deep level to be successful. And I think that's part of the appeal of it.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, so would you say, when we are fly fishing, that requires a pretty deep understanding of the natural environment that the trout are in and how they behave. What are some things that you study or look at when you're looking at water that maybe help you increase your chances of catching fish? Would that be certain times of the year that things change, weather patterns? What's some of the things that you look at whenever you do go out fly fishing?
that is a big question,
It
Marcus,
is pretty loaded. It
because
is pretty loaded. So I guess let me
and
let's
I can break it down for you.
okay. Yeah, if you want
And I
to.
guess, yeah, in a simple way. Um, yes, obviously, weather has an impact on streams, and temperature has an impact, and
Mhm.
time of year and season, and the bugs that are hatching, and
Right.
the location. All these things have an impact. But in general, if I'm going to a stream, I want to first understand the topography of the area. I want to understand how much descent's happening. That's going to change water depth in places. When I come to the stream, I'm going to be trying to visualize it both from above and from a side dissection. Where is the water moving? Where is the current the swiftest? Where is the structure? Because typically, if you can immediately locate structure, there's a good chance that you can find fish if they're present in the stream. The way that the water moves through the stream, and where there's oxygenated water more than the next area, may indicate where the fish are. And then you get into, like you had mentioned, the time of the year. If it's in the springtime, then there might be a higher likelihood that fish have moved out of deeper water from their winter hold up into faster water, where they're more likely to be feeding on bugs that are now active. But typically, the first thing I'm doing is visualizing the stream when I walk up. And I'm also, I would have prepped prior to understand the, ecology or the biology of that particular stream.
Mm-hmm.
What might the fish be eating there?
Yep.
What type of fish are they? I'm looking at all those different factors and stream features to try to add up to a plan that's going to be successful.
Right. Now, do you consider yourself more of a trout bum than anything, or is there some other fish that you enjoy chasing?
So I do have a soft spot in my heart for the native brook trout in Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's just because growing up, that's the first fish that I really encountered. When I was very young, going to my uncle's cabin to deer hunt, at 9 or 10 years old, and seeing a spring that came up where they got drinking water that eventually turned into a wider body of water that had these little fish that were colorful and lived under the bank.
Mm-hmm.
Was kind of always fascinating to me.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing guys that could swing a worm under the bank and catch these fish. It's like, what are these fish?
They're gold.
And yeah, and I can even remember, walking down to his hunting cabin spring. It was kind of like a spring house, and there was a big lid you would pull off to pot water. And I can even remember seeing brook trout down in that spring, like swimming around.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just one of the first fish I have memories of. So I have a soft spot for those trout because I think they're native here, and there's a special connection to Pennsylvania in that regard.
For sure.
And so I think those fish, but also, through my time fishing, I also have gained this interest in pursuing other fish, and that would include, steelhead trout here in Pennsylvania and Erie, and the tributaries to Lake Erie. It would include the salmon up on the Salmon River in New York,
Yep.
The Lake Run brown trout coming out of Lake Ontario. All of those larger fish have become interesting. Of course, catching a big fish can be a lot of fun,
Yeah.
but it's pretty hard, Marcus, to match the beauty of where the brook trout live and that fish that's native to, the East and the Appalachian Mountain Range.
Yeah.
They just hold a special place.
Yep. I understand fully. I'm right there next to you. Man, there's just something about them. And like you said, it's great to catch big trout, and I am a big trout enthusiast with the best of them. But at the same time, you can take me on the stream, and if we're catching 5-inch brook trout, I mean, I'm grinning ear to ear the whole time because it's just fun. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's a lot of people that are not from the States or from Pennsylvania, they can't relate to that. I remember when I first started posting brook trout videos on YouTube, people would reach out from South America or Central America, and they'd be like, we use fish like that for bait down here. And, you can understand their thinking,
right?
And you can understand why it's probably humorous, but they don't have the context of why that fish is regarded the way it is in my mind. And you almost wish you could bring them up here to show them, and you almost would bet that they'd understand it after seeing it.
Yeah. I think, for the native brook trout, one thing is it's just how intricate and how the details come into play whenever you're in these small streams, these mountain streams, and you're working for these trout. You're if you're fly fishing them, you're bow casting, and there's some spots you just can't even roll cast. And you're just, you look at that piece of mountain laurel hanging over the stream right there, and it's only 3 inches from the top of the water, and you can see a heavy root system coming up over that, and the oxygenated water. There's bubbles coming right there, and it's like, I swear I get giddy like a child on Christmas Day when I see that, because you just know they're there. And you just got to get that fly or that lure or whatever you're using up underneath that bank, and hang on and have fun. And I think that that's what it is. I think it's just because of how involved you have to be with that. Whereas when you get out on a big river, yeah, you're reading the water and you're going to put yourself in a spot where, but you might cast 10 times in the same spot, moving down
Mm,
on a boat or on the bank side, and you're not really. I mean, you're just kind of casting out there, and you're just
mm.
there's not a lot of precision going into that cast at that moment, if you will.
That's kind of interesting that you mentioned that because, maybe that is part of the allure of brook trout fishing in Pennsylvania is just the fact that in some ways they are so predictable.
Yeah.
Um, but in other ways they're not.
Right.
And a lot of that's dictated by streams and all the other factors that we talked about.
Yeah. Yeah. The biggest thing that I would proclaim is that the brook trout is how I feel like you can get anybody really, really hooked because I've seen beautiful brown trout, I've seen beautiful rainbows, I've seen beautiful cutthroat trout. But
Hmm.
when you pull out a brook trout that's 10, 11 inches, that's a pretty girthy, long trout for a brook trout, and they have that orangish red belly, and
Mm,
the fins have the white tips to them, and
hmm.
they got the red dots are heavy down through them, and they have that purple bluish color. It just
Hmm.
I just think that they're the best looking trout in my personal opinion, and I think that there's not as many of them as there are wild brown trout. There's a lot of different states you can go and catch wild brown trout, and
Mm.
the brook trout are just they're just not all over the place. When you find them, yes, you usually find a vast majority of them, but you can go a lot more places and catch brown trout than you can these fish, and that's why our mountains of Pennsylvania are so highly regarded. And it's just something that we have really well. And you can follow the mountain range, of course, and you're still in the brook trout, but Pennsylvania's got a lot of really great brook trout streams. So
It sure does. It sure does. Let's hope it stays that way for
I
a long time.
yeah. Yeah, I mean that's the other thing too, if you do see those fish in that water, you do know that they'll give you a little insight on how good that water is because if it's not,
Mm,
they will not survive there. So,
100%.
when it comes to fishing, do you at the beginning of the year, maybe if you're fishing some stock water, do you kill or
Hmm.
eat any trout or anything like that, or are you mainly catch and release kind of guy?
I am 100% catch and release.
Okay.
It's not necessarily because I'm doing it because I only believe in catch and release.
Hmm.
I certainly do not have a problem with people eating fish that they catch.
Yeah.
And, especially with the stock trout, I have absolutely no problem at all. I
Right.
think that's actually the reason they were put in there
Yeah.
is
I'd agree.
put and take, right?
Yep, I'd agree with that.
So I have no issue with people keeping stocked fish. I think when you get into the wild trout,
Yeah.
certainly if the numbers are there from a management perspective, I don't have any problem with keeping them. I personally would not keep wild trout to eat, just because I appreciate their beauty. But kind of the irony of my life is that the reason that I don't keep and eat any trout is because I actually have an allergy to fish.
Oh, okay.
So
Hmm.
I cannot eat fish.
Yeah.
And every time I tell everybody that, they're like, "Well, that's ironic," and I'm like, "Yeah, it's pretty much the definition of irony."
So how
But
I guess I have to
yeah.
ask, how did you stumble upon that? Like how did you find out that you were in fact, allergenic to eating fish?
So just to be clear, because people always ask this, so how do you touch fish if you have an allergy to them? And I say, well, it's not touching them; it's
Hmm.
actually eating the fish. I
Right.
can't eat the fish.
Right.
So I found that out when I was a kid. My mother used to feed me and my sister fish sticks with French fries,
Yeah, of course.
and it would always make my lips puff up. And I was like, Mom, these things, I can't eat them. And she thought that I was just trying to get out of eating dinner. And it was actually an allergy. And then that was later confirmed
Yeah.
later on in my life by actually going to an allergist and having the fish protein in one of those tests where they prick your back and they put the protein over top and they see if you react. And
Hmm.
fish are just for whatever reason. That's one of my things. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you. I don't think that you're missing out too much on that stuff. Now, I'm sure that that's, shellfish are probably in with that. And my wife and I enjoy eating a lot of different shellfish, and we really enjoy eating sushi. So I guess you
Well,
probably
believe it or not, I can eat shellfish,
okay.
which is really strange. A
Okay.
lot of people usually, have it the other way around. They
Hmm.
can't eat shellfish, but they can eat
Right.
fish.
Well, then
But for me, it's fish.
you come out on top if you ask me, because you're eating the finer things for sure.
I do like shellfish, but I'll tell you, sometimes, just from an eating healthy perspective, sometimes I wish I could eat salmon and
Yeah.
rock bass or
Hmm.
whatever
Yep.
the great tasting fish out there are. Sometimes I wish I could enjoy it, but
Yep. Yep. I understand that.
that's what the road I've walked. So
So when it comes to different conservation efforts and stuff,
hmm
keeping on track with the catch and release, is
hmm
there anything else that you want to preach or talk about? Like, I don't know. Obviously, we want people to pick up their trash and stuff like that. But
hmm
is there anything else? I have seen something lately brought up, and it's them people moving rocks and stuff in the stream.
mm,
Um,
yeah.
is that something you run into a lot when you're out fishing?
So conservation comes in a lot of different looks. And one of the things I've learned, and look, I never have considered myself an expert in anything, and anything I'm saying now is just knowledge I've picked up along my journey. But one of the things I've learned about fish in Pennsylvania and trout in general is that conservation for them really needs to start with the water source. And anybody you talk to that is serious in the trout game and in the trout conservation game will probably all start with clean water.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing I would say is I think supporting clean water initiatives and supporting companies and things that promote clean water and responsible dumping and those types of things, that is important. Protecting our watersheds is a big part of protecting trout.
Yep.
So once you get past that, and maybe you're actually talking more about the act of fishing, it's a lot of the things that you see that maybe when you first got into this sport you just didn't understand. But in brook trout fishing specifically, we always talk about hooks with no barbs or
Mm-hmm.
barbs that are pinched,
Yeah.
and that truly is critical. Anybody who's fished for brook trout with a fly rod, well, actually any rod, will understand that if you put a barbed hook through a brook trout's mouth, there's a good chance that you are going to injure the fish trying to get the barb out.
Mm-hmm.
So that is one of the first things I will say is barbless hooks are absolutely important to keeping down mortality rates of brook trout. It's just the truth. I'm not saying they're not hardy, but barbless hooks are important because they are fragile fish in a lot of ways.
Right.
I also think, one thing I always wrestle with, and some people would probably get irritated by this comment, but a lot of guys come to me and say, "Hey, did you ever do tenkara fishing?" And one of the things I don't like about tenkara is that it offers, in my opinion, now this might be different on very small streams, but I feel like it offers less control of the fish and getting the fish to the net.
Mm-hmm.
If I have a reel, I can reel that fish. If I need to, I can get it into a net faster. So I'm a big proponent of using tools that will get the fish to the net. And then I think, the practice of trying to keep that fish in the water as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And, I know that there are some people that take an extreme position on never taking the fish out of the water. I don't necessarily take that position.
Mm-hmm.
I can appreciate it, but I don't necessarily take that position. But I do think it's just general sportsmanship and responsibility and respect for the resource. If you catch fish, use a net, preferably a rubber net. Keep the fish in the net as much as possible. Take your pictures. Don't, I think one of the interesting challenges we have in our generation, Marcus, is that with the advent of YouTube and social media,
Mm-hmm.
some people's desire to capture visual content probably sometimes puts the life of the fish at risk.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I think that that's something that's super important for our generation, to respect the fish and know that, hey, I can get a picture or I can get a video, but I can do it in a way that's responsible and not sit there handling a fish for 15 minutes in the net so that you can get a perfect shot.
Yeah. You
Um,
you're make that make yeah, I never heard that point brought up, but you make a great great point right there for sure.
and I see that a lot, and honestly, that's something else that I would say to anyone who listens to this is we have got to learn to be patient and be teachers of the younger generations because they're finding the same joys and passions, but they have all these new tools. They have all these social media platforms. They have cameras. They have cell phones, and they're going out and they're driven by this desire to capture content to share with their friends and with the world.
Hmm.
And sometimes that drives more of what they're doing than thinking about the fish. And I think finding ways to subtly remind people that that's important. And that's, when I started out, I didn't do it right. I didn't understand some of these things. And
Right.
it's one of those things, the more you do it, the more you spend time on a brook trout stream in the woods, and you realize how special of a resource, how fragile they are. You just kind of naturally learn, like, hey, this is how I have to treat these things to do it the right way. And I think finding ways to teach the young kids without blasting them and beating them over the head publicly is the right thing to do. And there's people that are out there that maybe just don't care, and that's a different discussion. But a lot of kids, they just don't know. They don't think about it. They don't see it that way. And I think we have an opportunity to train and educate the younger generations in a kind way. Like, hey, have you thought about this? We don't need to be YouTube comment police, and we don't need to be Facebook police, but we can find ways to show and remind people. And that's why if I do make a video now or I post something now, I try to do it in a way that demonstrates it in a way that I think respects the resource.
Hmm. Now you make a great point there. I haven't really thought about that. And then, like when you were saying about the tenkara rod, do you think when you're saying that, as far as not being able to control them as much, are you referring to like not being able to bring them in quick enough so they're wearing the fish out?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think a tenkara rod naturally, and again, the tenkara movement would probably be upset with me saying that, and my goal is not to
Right.
bash tenkara because I think there are places where you can do it ethically and everything's fine. But the reality is, if you don't have a reel on the fishing rod and you have a fish on the line that's large enough to put up a fight on a tenkara rod, there's no way to pull the line back in. So you're forced to try to use the rod itself to try to muscle it back towards a bank or something and try to get it to a net. And I feel like the reel being on the fishing rod provides more control that you don't have with the tenkara rod.
Yeah.
So to me, it's about having that control to be able to do things more effectively.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Again, maybe not every application there,
right.
I'm confident there's small streams where you could have a stick with a string and hook a 5-inch brook trout and bring it right to the net. But in many brook trout streams I've been in, if you're fishing a 10-foot wide stream and you have a tenkara rod and you get an 8, 9, or 10-inch brook trout, they will fight on that thing forever.
Hmm.
And you're probably adding, an extended period of time that you didn't need to be fighting that fish to a net.
Right. Yep. I understand exactly what you're saying.
And again, that comes from the perspective of just trying to respect the resource.
Just trying to be a steward of the water.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a lot of, I guess, lessons and growth within fly fishing or just fishing in particular. Is there any insights that you've gained from fly fishing or lessons that you learned on your journey that not only helped you in fly fishing actually, but maybe translated in any other areas of your life?
That is a really good question, and that's another deep one, right?
Yeah,
And
definitely.
you know, I mean, first and foremost, some of the places that I've hiked into, especially in the Appalachians in Pennsylvania,
Hmm.
have just given me a true appreciation for the resources that are available to us in this state and in the East, and how fragile some of those resources are, and how lucky and blessed I and others are to be able to go into a stream like that on our own, not see another person and experience that.
Yeah.
Um, it's hard to put that into words.
Yeah.
Um, but beyond that, life lesson wise, I think about some of the trips I've taken where I've had to problem solve, think on my feet.
Yeah.
Um, hiking 6 miles one way into a stream and then coming back out and being so exhausted to walk up a mountain that feels like it's almost 90 degrees straight up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Another thing I've learned is that the human body and the human mind, you can push past points of pain and exhaustion further than maybe you think you can.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of my brook trout fishing, when you hike that far and then come back and it's getting dark and I'm trying to get back to my truck, like you don't have a choice to stop.
Right.
Like I have to get back to my truck. And, there are times where I've been so exhausted that I literally am just standing on the side of a mountain, either in a patch of mountain laurel or on a field of rocks. And the sun's dropped behind, it's getting dark, and I am in so much physical exhaustion, I can't even raise my leg to go another 10 feet. And then you kind of tell yourself, like, I can push through this. And I think that's kind of an interesting perspective
For
because
sure.
there are other times in life where you can apply that and think, you know what, I can handle this. I can take it further. So
Yeah.
mentally and physically, you can always push yourself further than you really think you can,
Heck
even when
yeah.
it feels like you've exhausted yourself.
I love that. I love that answer. I love what you did with that question. And I think that there's just so much that goes into fishing that you can use throughout your life. My wife always tells me, she says, you're just so patient. And,
Mm,
I just think that through all outdoor activities, especially within hunting and fishing, that's just something that you just learn to do is just I guess basically how to calm your mind and how
mm,
to make proper decisions and judgments um, at any time. When you're fly fishing and you decide you're going to change flies, or you don't get overly excited and you go up and you could cast right in when you come up to a certain spot like a riff or a run, but you kind of look at it and you're like, well, yeah, it might be a little bit more for me to walk over to the other side of the creek and kind of get up in that tree and then try to cast, but like that's the run I need and that's what I want. And
mm.
so you kind of go that extra mile. And I'm just trying to, I guess, put it into somebody's mind here where I'm going with this, and how that relates into other forms of your life is you have that patience, or you have
Mm.
that ability to, when presented with a challenge, to come out on top and have it figured out in a timely manner, and not really lose your mind over it either.
Yeah,
So
that makes a lot of sense. I would agree with the patience piece. And, one other thing that came to mind when I was thinking about that was there are so many times in life where maybe you think you have everything figured out,
hmm
and then you see things from a different perspective and it changes the entire way you view things.
yeah.
And that has happened to me many, many times in fly fishing where I thought I understood something, whether it was the way you look at a stream or the way you drift nymphs through a run,
hmm
and you meet someone and they share information with you, or you read something or you watch something, you're like, wow, I never thought about it from that perspective. And it changes everything and makes you better. And I think that's why it's really important in fly fishing to try to be humble, and you're never going to know it all.
hmm
It's a lifelong learning pursuit. And I think that's one of the things I love about it. And I like that you can think you have it figured out only to learn something and have it completely change the way you do everything.
Yeah. But you know what? That is a testament to who you are within your mind too, and the kind of person you are, because see, and I feel like this is really prominent in the outdoor community. People of the outdoors are very open-minded, and they are willing to listen and learn, for the most part in almost all scenarios and applications. Unfortunately, some of I don't want to get into politics at all, but on the other spectrum, you can't even have a conversation,
Mm,
right? Where it's just, no, that's not it. You're wrong. This is the way it is.
mm.
And that's
Yeah, I
why
don't think that's good. I don't think that's good uh, with anything in life. I think it's always good to listen.
Mhm. Yeah, and be able to draw your own opinions, and still, you take somebody else's opinion into perspective, and you kind of just, well, let me step into your shoes for a second and try to see where
Hmm.
you're coming from. And sometimes, that's some of the best lessons I've ever got in my life have been when someone says something to me and I actually have to turn around and think about it for a couple minutes, and I go, "Holy shit, you just blew my mind!" Like,
I would agree with that. Yeah.
that's the best stuff, man, and that's why, you know, yeah, that's why when you get somebody who is a little bit more contradictive of what your thinking is, it can be really, really intriguing to see or kind of feel where they're going with different things. And
Mm,
usually that is where we learn because we may have been showed something. There's things. Boy, God bless my dad and my family, my pap, and all that. They have taught me and showed me everything that I really have used as a baseline and learned and went my own route on. But there's some things I've seen where, hey, this person showed me this, and I'm telling you, this is probably the better way to do it. So,
mm,
being open-minded like that, I feel like is, a huge factor, at least to my success in life, not just only in the
hmm
outdoors community. So,
hmm I would agree with that.
well, we all like catching really big trout,
Hmm.
at least as fishermen. And I guess, would you rather catch a number of fish, or would you rather catch that one memorable fish?
Oh boy, can I have both?
I know, right? We all want both, but I can tell you, and I'll give you a quick story. So I was on the stream this one day, and I left here in the morning. It was early. It was like 5:30. Um, and I told my wife, I said, "Hey, I'll be back around 10 o'clock." That's usually about the time I like to roll back in. So
Hmm.
I'm not gone for too long. So I'm not on the "Hey, where you been" list, but I got my fix in. So um, usually I like to get 4 hours on the stream if I can, but um, I was out fishing. It was just one of them days. Like I just was skunked up. I had a couple fish on, lost some fish. I had lost two larger trout. Persistence, though, I'm not going to go back to the truck. Did I want to throw my rod in the tree or break it in half for a second? Yeah, but you figure out, hey, there's more in here, and
Mm,
you press forward and you work. And I had only caught like four fish, and it just wasn't looking too good. But I pressed on, and I went a little bit further up this stream than I normally do, and I actually ran into this great bend, and I seen it from a ways, and I'm like, man, this is going to be it. This is going to be a great spot. And lo and
hmm
behold, it's still one of the biggest brook trout that I've ever caught in that
mm,
run there. And I hooked him on the first cast, brought him in, good fight, and then as soon as I hooked him, he run real low right to the bottom. I love when they do that. Goodness gracious, do I love that because it gets so
mm,
heavy when they do that. And pull me to the bottom, and I could see where there was some mountain laurel roots and stuff, and I was skeptical for a second. I thought, oh dang, don't you run me up into there because I'm not you're not coming back from that one. So
mm,
I was able to turn the rod and kind of get him to spin and come back towards me. And as soon as I netted him, and I'm not one for usually actually using a net all the time, but I did have a net on me that day, and I netted him. And soon as he was in there, hook come out, and it was one of them ones I just remember. I have pictures of that fish, and I think that I have posted them on the Instagram page before, but um, was one of those Super Bowl memorable fishes, and I only caught four trout altogether that day, and that's very uncommon
mm,
for me. I would say I'm usually good for at least, I don't know, anywhere from 8 to 20 or more if it's a really
hmm
good day. But is there any instances you can think of where you had one of them super memorable moments? And I don't want to just go revert back to that first fish you caught on a fly rod because I can also remember mine too. But
hmm
um, Is there any one that sticks out right away as soon as I bring up something like that?
Well, I will first say that, and I get this comment on videos I've posted in the past. A lot of guys will say, "Why didn't you use a woolly bugger there? Because, there was probably a giant fish sitting down in there." And I'll be the first to admit that there's times where I'm out fishing and perhaps could be changing up what I'm using more frequently. But honestly, I just look at the water
Mm-hmm.
and, I pick a stream. It's usually about exploration for me.
Yeah.
It's about the excitement of not knowing what's in that stream.
Yep.
And sometimes that results in a big fish that I wasn't expecting. And other times it results in a lot of small fish.
Right.
And honestly, I'm okay with what that stream gives up on that particular day. And to me, that's all part of the experience. Now, I know that there's a hardcore group of guys out there that, they like to chuck big streamers and they literally will walk miles and miles just for that goal of catching the one big fish. And I appreciate that.
Right. Right.
And maybe one day I'll do that. But for me, I just like doing the research of finding a stream, making it a target. I particularly love fishing water I've never fished before, especially when it comes to the brook trout.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that adventure of walking into something you don't know what you're going to find. And when it does result in a big fish, to me, that's just one of those trips that is a cherry on top.
Yeah.
And yes, I have handfuls of memories like that sprinkled through my adventures across Pennsylvania where, I went into it not expecting much and came out um, finding, a trophy fish, whether it was a brook trout or a brown trout.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, there's a couple that stick out. I can remember specifically fishing a stream in Bradford County
Mm-hmm.
where I had walked a stream probably in early June, and I remember catching a lot of small fish. I didn't see a lot of fish, and again, it was for me just trying to push through to fish this section of stream. And I think it was probably in the last 10 minutes of that hike that there was a small plunge pool, and I kind of lackadaisically threw my dry fly in there. And I watched this probably 4 or 5 year old class native brook trout come up out of the depths of this little waterfall
Mm-hmm.
and just slowly suck my fly in off the surface. And to this day, that's probably the most beautiful, most mature brook trout I've caught in the state of Pennsylvania. And I wasn't really there looking for that at the time, but that's how that trip ended, and it made it super special. So
Yeah.
I think that's kind of the draw for me, is that not knowing what that trip's going to hold or what that stream's going to hold that day.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing to remember. Just because you fish one stream one day and that stream gives you that experience doesn't mean you won't come back 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years later and have a completely different experience. There's a lot of factors that play into how that day played out the way it did.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah. I mean, oh my goodness, the amount of factors that play into that are astronomical. Sometimes the stars align, and you're just there at the right place at the right time, and next thing you know, you landed a 22-inch wild brown or a 13, 14-inch native brook trout, and you're just in shock and awe that it's there, and you feel like, hey, I'm going to mark this on my map, and I'm going to go back and catch them. And some guys, in some places, I know of one trout in particular that guys catch, and it's just they go there the same time of the year, and it's like the fish goes there. And other times of the year, it's like he's not there. So, um,
Yeah, and there's a lot of reasons for that too.
yep.
One of the things I've learned with native brook trout and wild brown trout are, these fish move a lot.
Hmm.
And I think that's hard for a lot of people to wrap their head around. Just as much as some of these small streams get low in the summer and some of those fish will go under rocks and they pretty much will hide under those rocks or undercut banks, even when the water gets very, very low.
Hmm.
There are a lot of fish that are living within water systems where they can retreat to a lake or a pond or another stream. And a lot of people don't realize how an entire population of fish can move from one stream into a lake for the summer or something along those lines. And I think that was a big eye-opening thing for me too, because one year all those fish in a good water year might stay in that stream, whereas the next year in a low water year, all those fish might move into a lake. And if you fish that stream in those two different situations, you're going to take away two entirely different experiences. And it's important not to define the stream based on one or the other.
Yeah, yeah, you make a great point. They are, and that's why we just chase them. You know, we're chasing these fish because they're gonna do whatever they want, and we're just here to chase them
Hmm.
around and try to catch them.
Yep.
So when you are out fly fishing, yeah, obviously there's multiple forms of using flies. Now,
Hmm.
are you more of, hey, I would really like to fish the top water, or do you enjoy nymphing maybe more? Is there is there anything you, I guess, what is your preference?
A lot of that is dictated by conditions. The
Mm-hmm.
conditions kind of drive what's happening, and maybe the time of the year as well.
For sure.
My experience has shown that the majority of the year, even with wild brook trout, native brook trout,
Mm-hmm.
nymphing is very successful. I've gone on many brook trout streams where, most guys would be like, wow, you got to throw a dry fly there. And if the water levels are good, and especially late winter, early spring, nymphing is the meal ticket, because I've found that oftentimes those fish are not looking to the surface. They're subsurface and
Yep.
eating nymphs. And then there's other times of the year, once you get past, mid-April, those fish do start looking up, and they're looking for bugs that are on that waterway, or they're looking for terrestrials falling into the stream. And at that point, moving to the surface is more successful. And so for me, it's really driven by the conditions and the time of year. And
Mm-hmm.
I really do enjoy nymphing because some people hate it, but I'm an indicator guy. I love watching that indicator dart under the surface. And but you need water to do that successfully. You
Right.
need you need good current and good flow for those nymphs to move through a run. And if it's there, I love to fish indicators. But there's also the draw of the dry fly on the surface, whether it's just a standard dry fly or a dry dropper rig. And knowing, like you described earlier, that if you find that perfect plunge pool or that perfect run that has that just slight cloudiness to the run and the water, that the fish can't see you. It's not quite clear enough. And if you drop that dry fly at the top and let it run through down on the surface, that something's probably going to attack it. That is hard to match the excitement and the fun of fishing, dry flies in those situations. So, for me, it's about conditions. I do love to nymph. If you watch my videos, you'll know that. But I also love fishing the surface too. So I think it's just dictated by the conditions, time of year.
Yep, I agree with you totally. I think that there's just something to be said in the excitement form of, I've had fish really whack a nymph where you don't. I mean, yeah, you have an indicator or whatever, but you don't even need it. I mean, they're ripping on it right now, and
Correct.
that's great, especially when you're running like a heavy riff in the water. It's like they
Hmm.
just they're gonna hook themselves,
Hmm.
but there's something to be said for sight fishing when you see a
Hmm.
fish, especially when they just dart to it. Like we were saying, like the brook trout, and it just hits the water, and all of a sudden you just see this shadowy figure, and it's
Hmm.
coming, and it's like you hear the Jaws theme. It's like dun it, and
Yep.
it just whacks it, and
Yep.
that's just super exciting. This so sight fishing, I think for me is a little more exhilarating, but I also think and
Mm.
believe I think that fishing with a nymph, for me, I'm not the most advanced or best fly fisherman, but I can
Hmm.
catch fish on nymphs.
Hmm.
When it comes to dry flies, I have a much harder time catching fish with dry
Mm.
flies. So I personally believe and think that there's a little bit more that goes into dry flies. Now, if you have the right fly and you're casting into a pool that they're surfacing on, yeah, you're gonna have a
Hmm.
hell of a day. But
Hmm.
um, It's
Yeah, there's a lot of factors there.
for
You
sure.
know, I think again, some of it comes with learning. A lot of guys who maybe get into brook trout fishing with a dry fly, they might immediately go for a fly that's maybe too large for the fish that they're chasing. And when that happens, you'll have a lot of splashes and a lot of missed hookups.
Hmm.
But you downsize, that size 14 to something smaller like a 16 or an 18, and suddenly you might be hooking up every cast. Um, so it's really just a matter of learning and experimenting at times.
Yeah, and I think it runs right back to the preservance and patience that we were talking about
Hmm.
earlier. Whether you're willing to do what it takes to learn, or you're
Hmm.
not. And
Hmm.
that kind of segues into the next thing I want to talk about.
Hmm.
What are some resources or books or websites, or maybe even if you want to do some shout out to some mentors that you've had in the past, that you think or would like to put out there that may or may not help others as they may have helped you?
Sure. Um, I'm happy to talk about that. And, I think oftentimes when I hear that question asked, you can almost like guess like what at least like 50% of the responses are going to be because you hear, a lot of people have been influenced by a lot of the same things. And,
Right.
and I appreciate that.
Right.
But I'll try to answer it as honestly as I can. I mean, for me, learning about fly fishing absolutely started with people in my inner circle. So it was, like I said, my father instilled the love of fishing in me, and there were certain people throughout my life journey that played a role, and it was often close friends that just happened to fly fish, and those are people I chose to spend time with. And my first thing to people would be surround yourself with a friend or somebody that fly fishes and explain your interest. And, a good person's going to kind of take you under their wing and share their knowledge and get you started. And then don't give up. You need to know that you're not going to pick it up right away, but the more you push into it, the more you're going to progress. But there are certainly things there's content and there's mentors and teachers that have influenced me one way or the other throughout my life. There's the professional faces that I watched on TV, or now on YouTube, or maybe even I'll probably date myself a little bit by saying VHS. Um, but yeah, I mean, some of these guys are truly legends for that reason, that everybody knows who they are and we're exposed to their content in the early days. Joe Humphreys, I learned some invaluable nymphing information, especially about adding weight to a line and how to add it to a line and how to drift nymphs, from Joe Humphreys and watching some of his early teaching videos.
Hmm.
Lefty Cray, both seeing him speak in person
Hmm.
and watching him on television, that guy really impacted the way I thought about casting a fly rod and a fly line. And so Lefty Cray was always somebody that I really looked up to from the casting perspective. Um, George Daniels, like the nymph god, and he's really known for his Euro nymphing. But I definitely picked up some tips from listening to him. He really has a way of breaking things down in a very articulate manner, very detailed, complicated things, especially reading water
Hmm.
and currents. I learned a lot listening to him, sitting in a couple of his seminars. And, I have a lot of old books growing up, like, some of the early Orvis books, stuff I picked up at garage sales.
Yeah.
Uh, some of those old books really do a good job of just, cementing the fundamentals that go into fly fishing. And sometimes those are just the most important things you need to take off. Um, YouTube nowadays is just an endless world of learning.
It's a whole
Um,
university.
it really is. And the one thing I will say about YouTube, and it's not because I have an axe to grind, but you do need to be careful because, and this is why I've always been tried to be cautious on my channel, because I am not an expert. I'm just a regular guy that's learned to fish and has a passion for it. And some of the things I've said have helped people. But there are people out there that they start fishing, they get followers, and next thing you know, they're being regarded as, well, this guy must know what he's talking about. And I would say, and this is really important for the young kids to know, 50,000 followers on YouTube does not equate fly fishing mentorship or expertise. Um, I will say that people that fish a lot certainly are exposing themselves to a lot of situational learning, and I think that's valuable. So I'm not saying, that YouTube's bad, but you just have to take things with a grain of salt and filter it and process it.
Yeah.
And there are definitely, the cream rises to the top in the world, and there's guys that are legends for a reason. And I think you just need to take things through social media with a grain of salt. A lot of people are popular for reasons beyond fishing knowledge and expertise. Sometimes they're famous just for pure entertainment purposes.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's important to know. But, I grew up reading Fly Fisherman magazine. I remember reading the Drake. I remember, books that are critical around here. I mean, I wore out the Pennsylvania trout streams, Paul Weimer's books. There's just so many of them. I would just encourage people, whether it's at a garage sale or whether it's just going and picking up something on Amazon or on your Kindle now. I guess they're electronic now.
Yeah.
Just start somewhere. Start with the fundamentals and build from there. And just remember that there are people that have walked these paths before you. And that's something I always try to keep in mind too. That thought always crosses my mind when I walk in these brook trout streams in the middle of nowhere, and somewhere in the back of my head, I'm thinking, yeah, I'm probably the only person that's been here for a long time. And there's always been somebody there. Somebody was there before you. Somebody walked that place and appreciated it. Somebody knew that place. I think it's always important to have that perspective.
Yeah, I agree 100% and tenfold there because there's always someone that blazed the path for us and left something there for us, and that's what we need to do moving forward. And I guess that can segue into something else we can talk about. As a well-traveled, fly fisherman, I know that you've been around a couple of different places, and the show is about Pennsylvania. So I would like for you to try to rank Pennsylvania within your fishing adventures. And, we're kind of specifically talking about trout. So where would you put our state as far as our trout fishing in your experiences on I don't want to say a ranking system, but just how do you feel about our state as a whole?
Well, I guess it depends how you define trout fishing. Are you talking about big fish, number of fish, number of streams? The one thing I will say that's unique about Pennsylvania is we have probably more miles of trout stream with wild native fish or stocked fish or just trout in general than probably many of the states in the country. I don't know the actual stat there, but I just know that out of all the states in the country, we have more miles of fishable water than probably most states. I couldn't tell you which ones rank higher, but I know we're up there. And I think that is probably my biggest takeaway. There's no doubt that there are streams in the West that maybe hold heavier populations of wild fish in one stream. And, I remember a stat that always stuck out to me. I think there's a stat that says that Spring Creek up in State College has more brown trout per square mile, or just as many brown trout per square mile of some of the greatest streams in Montana. Yeah. So that gives you some idea of like how good fishing is in central PA. But I think it really comes down to just fishable water. And even beyond that, accessible water. Pennsylvania has a lot of wonderful public land wild trout fishing, especially in the northern tier in the central part of the state. It's just, I don't know if you can match that anywhere in the country. All that public land and all those miles of trout water especially with the native brook trout. We're just very lucky to have that. In Pennsylvania, I mean, you're asking a guy who has done the majority of his fishing in the Northeast
Hmm.
and Pennsylvania. So,
Right.
Pennsylvania is my number one. Um, it's always fun to go out of state and to explore other places. But to me, no place is going to match that walking up into that mountain hollow a few miles and finding that place that very few people lay eyes on in a 12-month period and being able to catch a native brook trout. To me, that's pretty special. Um, and there's miles and miles of it in Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
and it's publicly available.
It's crazy.
So for me, Pennsylvania is number one.
Yeah.
But I'd have to say I'm biased.
Well, I am biased too, but I do plan on doing some traveling with my fishing rod. Now, when I say that, I don't think that the trips will be sole purpose of fishing.
Hmm.
Unless I get down on the Green River, then that will definitely be a purposeful fishing trip for large brown trout. But um,
Yeah,
if I
and
get,
I would say, Marcus, that you know, based on the other East Coast states that I've fished, New York has some great fishing. I mean, everybody knows about the Catskills,
hmm,
the Adirondacks.
yep,
Then you have some streams in Western Maryland. You have some streams in Western Virginia. I would say that West Virginia is kind of a sleeper state,
hmm,
and people from West Virginia probably hate to hear me say that
yeah,
because they're like, "Don't tell people about West Virginia." But West Virginia is absolutely uncharted territory. It reminds me of Pennsylvania a lot in that way.
hmm,
I can't speak. I don't know West Virginia enough from a public land access point, but I would imagine there's probably a good amount of public land access down there. I just think West Virginia is a state that most people, it just kind of goes off people's radar. I think it's becoming more on people's radar
yeah,
with the internet and with YouTube, but I think there's some excellent untapped native trout fishing in West Virginia that rivals what's in PA. But at the end of the day, PA absolutely has so much water to walk and fish.
right,
And I just don't think you can compare it to North Carolina or Georgia or Virginia or Maryland or New York.
right.
Some people argue till they're blue in the face about New York and the Catskills, especially the West Branch and some of the things that go on up there. But Pennsylvania is a pretty amazing state.
Yeah. I think we do it really well. And sometimes, as much as I appreciate the natural resources that have been farmed and taken beforehand, what they have left is sometimes not so good, with your mine runoff and such and stuff like that. And sometimes I think, boy, I can't imagine the amount of waterways, especially in my area, because I am an old coal country, old soft coal country, and um, there's streams that, oh my God, I'm telling you, to read the water and look at them, if it was good water, these streams would be killer. I mean, they would hold large trout. I know they would hold large trout, and just vast amounts of them because they're just the way they bend. I have a small stream that runs through the game lands not far from where I'm at, and it's just sulfurized, and it's a shame because it the way it bends and moves, goodness gracious, would it have some nice brook trout in it? I'm sure of it. But unfortunately, that's what we need to do. We need to try to clean up stuff like that, and in conservation efforts, we need to make sure that we have these streams for our kids and their kids and whoever is going to follow us to fish. So, um,
100%. And, it's funny because, I always spend time up in the Big Pine Creek Valley
mhm,
every spring with some friends. And we've talked quite a bit with people that know the history of that area. And just that area alone, if you read back before the logging companies came in, Big Pine Creek apparently used to be loaded with large native brook trout. And when they took those tree canopies away and they cut those mountains down, it just completely changed the dynamic. Those fish were no longer in Big Pine Creek. They primarily moved into the headwaters. And you just think about all the places throughout the Appalachians where some impact of development or industrial
Yeah.
efforts, changed the landscape of the way it was originally. And man, just to be able to go back, imagine being able to go back 200 or 300 years to what it was like originally.
Yeah.
I just can't imagine. I mean, certainly the native brook trout in the Appalachians has lost a very large percentage of its home range. And I think that's a lesson we need to learn from, and really conserve what we have now. But it would have just been mind blowing to see it in its natural state years ago.
Yeah. I agree 100%. And sometimes I think people don't realize just how much, I guess, little it takes to change the way a stream is. The way the water rolls off a hillside. Whenever you take 40 acres of trees up, take and clear cut right up above that or something, and how that affects the way that there's shade on the creek, or that the water rolling down the hill gets caught and taken into the soil instead of just running down over. And now your stream is full of soot, or mud, or it rains and it's just muddy for days in there. And there's a lot to be said. And with that, I mean, do you feel or think that the Pennsylvania Fish Commission does a very good job in what they do with stuff like that? Is there anything you would like to see changed, or anything you'd like to give them a shout out on that you think that they're doing especially well in?
I'll be honest with you. I can't say that I am close enough to everything that the Fish Commission is doing to conserve or protect native trout. There are definitely people in the state and in the community that can speak to it much, much better than I would be able to. So I'm hesitant to even answer that question.
Okay.
I do know that in recent years, it seems as if there's been more of an interest on the part of the Fish Commission to want to do more for native or wild trout populations.
Yep.
And, I know that they have like a trout summit, or I remember them having some type of a wild or native trout summit just a couple years back. And I know there's people, I think even seeing people like George Daniels or George Daniels' wife involved in things at the Fish Commission is probably positive, because that they bring a certain perspective to things, and I'm sure that that's influencing their perspectives. I can say that some of the things that happen with stocking trout, meaning hatchery raised trout, in wild streams, some of that does not make sense to me. Even going back to like Pine Creek, you look at some of the stocking that goes on in a water system like that, knowing that many of those fish cannot inhabit that stream in the middle of the summer where the water temps get up into the 70s or higher. They are absolutely, if they're not finding cold water springs on the bottom of Big Pine Creek, they're absolutely moving upstream into headwaters. And if it's a brown trout that's been stocked and then that trout takes resident and populates, now you're talking about fish impacting native trout populations. And now you start getting into a real hot button issue that I certainly am not necessarily equipped to speak to, but I definitely think it's something that we as anglers need to be aware of, because, our native trout populations are certainly fragile and special. And I think we at least need to be aware of when the programs that we're implementing potentially have adverse effects on them, that we can make smart decisions and have smart conversations about it.
Yeah.
So I would leave it at that. I don't necessarily want to speak to what the Fish Commission is or isn't doing, because I don't feel like I'm necessarily qualified to speak on that. I think they do a lot of good things for fishing in the state, especially promoting it to younger fishermen. Is there room for improvement? I'm sure there absolutely is.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and the question's not to dog or to blast them or anything like that. It's just opinionated things that you or I feel or want to see, I guess, looked at more deeply. Because like you said, I'm not a biologist, you're not a biologist, so it's hard to speak on certain things. I guess it's one of those, hey, we're outside looking in, and maybe take a look at this or that. But
Yeah, I think if I could call one thing to attention, it would be a closer look at where we are putting populations of stocked fish
Hmm.
and how that's impacting wider water systems and wider native trout populations.
Yep.
I think that's something that needs to be maybe taken a little more seriously or looked at closer.
Yep. Yep. I think you make a great point and something to put under a microscope. I think that what happens a lot of the time is there's a political push for a certain spot to be stocked. And, when the shit rolls downhill, they have no choice sometimes but to just show up with a stock truck and put the fish in there. Um,
Mm,
and I unfortunately, I think that that's what happens. And maybe it is, maybe it's not. But I think I know of two spots that has happened. That's why I think that. But
hmm.
you were very well accomplished, I believe, fisherman. What kind of goals do you still have, or benchmarks would you like to reach? Maybe within the coming, couple years or anything. Is there anything you have slated on your plate that you want to achieve or get done, or hey, I got to do this before I can't move good or anything like that?
That's a really good question. You know, I'm not really a guy that was ever, I was never really a fish counter. I never really, um, oftentimes I stop counting fish if I'm having a good day, but
Hmm.
I've never been one of those people that really follows like my personal best fish. I think if anything, it's really just continuing the exploration. Um, you know, I've fished a very large percentage of the Class A streams, those streams that are designated with that biomass rating here in the state. I've fished a lot of them. I'd love to be able to say I fished all of them. Um, but I would just honestly like to be able to walk as many natural trout reproduction blue lines in this state as possible. And I've also found an interest in fishing states around here. In the past year, where I live now here in the Lehigh Valley, I live on the eastern edge of the Lehigh Valley, just below the Poconos. And,
Hmm.
I'm close to New Jersey, and you have a lot of streams that are tributaries to the Delaware River, which hold wild trout. And then even systems inland, um, trying to chase wild trout in a state like New Jersey is a whole new challenge.
Yeah.
And it presents a completely different set of circumstances and environments. And there's something fascinating about that to me. But really, at the end of the day, I think for me, it's really about that exploration and seeing that place that I haven't seen before, walking water I haven't seen before. Um, I think that's really what drives me. And the other thing I would say about that, Marcus, which has been a real learning experience for me, I think I mentioned this to you earlier. Even when you go fish these, a lot of guys get zoned in on those class A streams, and there are streams that have class B ratings and C ratings and D ratings based on the biomass. But one of the things I've learned in my time exploring is that you got to remember the Fish Commission surveys these streams, and some of these streams that have a Class A rating may have been surveyed years ago,
Yep.
and it may not hold a Class A rating anymore. It
Yep.
may have only held a Class A rating for a short period of time, and many of these streams, um, they're going through cycles with the age classes of fish. One stream might fish great for a couple of years and then be just small young of year for several years after that. And that's why when you find these streams that have these older age class fish, it really is a treat because those fish have been there. I think a brook trout lives on average for about, a max of 5 years.
Hmm.
So when you think about, finding a stream that has a great age class of brook trout, that's a pretty incredible experience because it might only be there for a short time. And then the young of the year come back around, and you may go through that stream and not catch those same, 9, 10 inch brook trout. So I kind of look at the Class A and the other ratings as just a small guide to a much bigger story. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. I think a lot of people just immediately equate Class A to, well, it's Class A, I got to go fish it. When really there might be a Class B or a Class C stream that is now Class A. But you also have to keep in mind what are things like water quality. And, a stream that has poor water quality until it's cleaned up is always going to have poor water quality. And that is going to not be to the advantage of a strong fish population, at least in the case of brook trout.
Right.
But if you find a stream that's healthy with clean water and it was Class B one year, it might be Class A the next year. It's always changing. It's always shifting. It's always evolving. A low water event could damage a population for a period of time. So there's a lot of things to be aware of, and I think that's another thing that makes the exploring fun. Is you never really know what you're going to walk into. You can put certain data points together to say, I think that stream could be good, but until you actually get out there and walk it and fish it, you just don't know.
Yeah, you make a great point, because I have seen streams change where, 3 years before that I fished that thinking, man, I can't wait to get back there, and I finally get back there and I'm like, what the heck happened here? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and kind of like the life cycle, I've never actually even thought of that. You make a great point, how they could all, be a certain age, kind of all die off, and then, what you're left with is just your 3 to 5 inch smaller natives, and then they got to rebuild and come back, just kind of like some other animals, turkeys, rabbit, some other things they have.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what data points me to say that, Marcus, is that there are states that border Pennsylvania that they do stream surveys where they look specifically at the age class of the fish in the survey. So what happens is you can look at a survey in an adjoining state, and they might say, well, we surveyed this 2 miles of stream and we caught 6 fish that were of this age class, and we caught 30 fish that were young of year, meaning they were very small.
Right.
And then they go back the next year and there might not be any older age class brook trout and all young of year. And maybe the young of year is small, or maybe it's larger. And so that to me really speaks to that idea that if they're surveying the stream and they're seeing those types of movements in the population, it's a constantly evolving and moving thing. So you can't just pin it down to, oh, it's Class A, it's good fishing. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes it does,
Right.
but oftentimes it does not.
Yeah, like you said, I mean, I know of probably 2 Class A streams where, now that makes sense now that you say that, because they're good streams, but they just, like, the biomass is not there. Where I can go to a stream that's not far from that one that would just be considered a wilderness stream, or a wild reproduction stream, and
Yep.
they're just more plentiful, they're bigger, and it's funny though, because I usually like when that happens, to be honest, because then
Right.
people quit fishing them streams and they get better again, that's for sure. But basically, I want to start wrapping it up here with us.
Sure.
I really appreciate you coming through with this conversation, and I would really like for you to promote what you're doing in your page and your videos, man, because I think that your content is really great, and I think everybody listening probably enjoyed this conversation and should really check out what you're doing and where you're at. So if you could just touch on where they can find you and how they can get a hold of you if they have any questions.
Sure. So my brand, I guess you could call it online, is called Woolly Bugged. That's WOOLYBUGGED. And if anybody ever wondered where I came up from with that name, it was actually a password I used that I just came up with on a whim to log into like an email account on Google or something. So that's where that name came from, and it kind of evolved into a blog. So Woolly Bugged was originally a blog, and I still have that out there at woollybugged.com. It documented a period of about 3 or 4 years where I wrote pretty heavily about the outings that I took, and I'll be the first to admit that I haven't been writing as much as I'd like to. I do plan to get back to it, and that's why it's still out there. But Woolly Bug kind of evolved into a YouTube channel then, and I do have a YouTube channel and an Instagram page under the Woolly Bug handle. I've kind of taken a little bit of a break from social media in the past year and a half, just because it's something that I just don't want to have dictate my life or even dictate the way I fish.
Yeah.
But it is something I will come back to, and I can promise that when I come back, I'm hopefully coming back better educated, with maybe more to share. And for me, it's somewhat of a creative release as well. So, but sometimes I just like getting out and fishing, and without having to worry about a camera or a picture. And so I hope anybody that's been a follower of my content doesn't take offense to maybe me not posting all the time. It's really just because I want to keep the fishing about the fishing. But yeah, if you ever want to check out what I do, it's Woolly Bug on YouTube, and on the blog and on Instagram.
Well, brother, I thank you so much, and I really hope everybody checks out what you're doing, because I've been following you for a couple years now, and your journey is really, really fun to watch, and I like reading some of your blog stuff. So maybe one of these days we can collab and do something on a blog together. I would really enjoy that, and just touch on some of the stuff that we really love about brook trout fishing or fishing in particular. But thank you so much for coming on, man. I couldn't ask for a better guest, and maybe we'll be able to check in with you next year or sometime soon and just see how everything's going.
Yeah, I appreciate the invite, Marcus, and enjoy what you're doing here. And I absolutely will take you up. Maybe we'll get together and do some brook trout fishing.
I would
somewhere up north here in Pennsylvania.
I would definitely love that. And yeah, I think we got some neutral ground that we can meet on and check out some nice fishing. So thank you for coming through, brother, and we'll talk to you soon in tight lines.
Thanks, Marcus. Appreciate it.
You have finished another episode of the Keystone Chronicles podcast. Guys, that's as I do at the end of every episode. I want to thank you so much for listening, and I love the network that we have going from this show and all the people that have been through. Mike, thank you so much for coming through. I really, really appreciated your time in the conversation. I love getting deep into people's minds like that. Guys, I got some stuff coming up here. I want to try to do a self-motivation / mindset episode once a week thrown in there. And I have something very large coming up here towards the end of July, and some swag on the way. So with that being said, guys, I appreciate it so much. I can't get enough of the love. And let's keep pushing. Guys that you know and women that you know that you think that need to be on this show, guys, reach out to me. I love hearing from you. Thank you so much. We'll continue to do what we do best, and that's bullshit. So we'll see you soon.